I moved into my apartment building 2 years ago, thrilled to finally have a place of my own after a long, exhausting search. The rent was decent, the area felt safe, and the building itself had that vintage charm I loved. The neighbors were mostly quiet, keeping to themselves, which suited me just fine. But there was one exception, the guy in 3B. From the moment I moved in, I felt something off about him. He was always around, lurking in the hallways or outside the building, watching everyone without ever speaking. I didn't know his name, nor had I ever seen him interact with anyone. His greasy, unkempt hair fell over his face, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes were the worst part, cold, lifeless, like he was seeing through you rather than at you. At first, I brushed it off as typical city behavior. People in big cities are often strange, and you learn to ignore them. But the more I saw him, the more uneasy I felt. He always seemed to be right there, wherever I went, whether I was getting my mail, walking down the hallway, or even grabbing a quick dinner from the cafe across the street. It was as if he knew my schedule, like he was studying me. One evening, as I was heading out for a late-night grocery run, I found him standing in the hallway, just staring at my door. It startled me so much that I dropped my keys. Excuse me," I muttered, bending down to pick them up. He didn't say a word. His eyes just followed me as I hurried past him. My heart raced as I felt his gaze burning into my back, and I rushed down the stairs as fast as I could. For the first time, I truly felt unsafe in my own building. When I returned from the store, I cautiously peered down the hallway before making my way to my apartment. Thankfully, he was gone, and I sighed in relief as I closed and locked the door behind me. But something about the encounter stuck with me, gnawing at my mind. Why was he standing outside my door? And why did I feel like I was being hunted? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I got up several times to check the locks on my door and windows, even though I knew they were secure. My apartment was on the second floor, with no fire escape outside my windows, but the sensation persisted. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I found something strange on my doormat, a small, folded piece of paper. My name was scrawled on it in messy, uneven handwriting. Heart pounding, I opened it. "You're always being watched." I dropped the note as if it burned my fingers, a cold chill running down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Who could have left it? Was it him? Was he watching me even now? I immediately took the note to the building manager, hoping they could help. They took it seriously, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. They promised to look at the building's security footage, but in the meantime, they suggested I be cautious and report anything unusual. I felt sick to my stomach. The building had always felt like a safe haven, but now I couldn't trust it. I started taking different routes to and from my apartment, changing up my schedule to avoid running into him. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the sense that someone, maybe he, was always watching me. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud bang outside my window. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled out of bed and rushed over to look. The street below was dark and quiet, with no sign of anyone. I checked my locks again and tried to calm down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it, a faint silhouette standing in the shadows across the street, right by the lamppost. My breath caught in my throat. Even in the dim light, I recognized the shape of the man from 3B. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly at my window. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my ears. How long had he been standing there? What was he planning to do? I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, explaining the situation as best I could. They told me to stay inside, and that they'd send someone over to check it out. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every creak of the building sending my anxiety skyrocketing. Finally, I heard a knock at the door. The police had arrived. They looked around the area but didn't find anyone. The man had vanished into the night. They reassured me that they'd patrol the area for the next few nights, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The next few days were tense, but quiet. I didn't see him again, and I began to hope that maybe he had moved on, or at least lost interest in me. But that hope was shattered one afternoon when I came home from work to find my door ajar. I froze in place, staring at the door as it slowly creaked open. I hadn't left it like that. My first instinct was to run, but instead, I cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment looked normal at first glance, but something felt off. I could feel it in the air, a subtle change, like the space had been disturbed. I walked through each room, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything seemed in its place until I reached my bedroom. The closet door was slightly open, a small crack that revealed darkness within. Swallowing my fear, I slowly approached the closet and yanked the door open, empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, but my relief was short-lived. As I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye, a small object on my bed. It was a photo of me, taken while I was sleeping. I screamed, dropping the photo and backing away, my mind racing. How did he get in? How long had he been watching me? I couldn't stay here anymore. Grabbing my phone, I called the police again, this time telling them everything. They arrived quickly and checked the apartment thoroughly but found no sign of forced entry. They advised me to stay somewhere else for a while, which I gladly did, crashing at a friend's place for the next few nights. But even there, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every creak, every shadow, felt like it could be him. I barely slept, my mind replaying the horrifying image of that photo. Eventually, I decided to move out of the building altogether. It wasn't worth the constant fear, the feeling of being haunted. I packed up and left within the week, vowing never to return. The police never caught the man, and as far as I know, he's still living in 3B, waiting for his next victim. But even now, in my new apartment, I can't help but wonder if he's still watching me, if maybe, just maybe, he followed me here. I was thrilled when I found the apartment. It was perfect, the kind of place I'd always dreamed of having. A small, cozy one-bedroom with a balcony overlooking a park, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much seemed to happen. The rent was affordable, too, which made me wonder why it hadn't been snatched up sooner. But when I met the landlord, he explained that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, so the unit had only recently become available. I didn't think much of it at the time. People move out of apartments all the time, right? Sometimes life just takes you in a different direction. But looking back, I wish I had asked more questions. My first few weeks in the building were quiet and uneventful. I kept to myself mostly, enjoying the peace of my new home. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I didn't see much of them. A couple lived across the hall, and an older woman lived on the floor above me, No one from my floor was particularly sociable, but I was fine with that. It wasn't until my second month that things started to get strange. One night, I was sitting on my couch, watching a late-night movie, when I heard a sound from the apartment next door. A faint, rhythmic thumping that was barely audible through the thin walls. At first, I thought it was just someone moving furniture around, but the noise continued for nearly an hour, never changing in pattern or intensity. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the best of me. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to get a better sense of what was going on. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who on earth would be making that kind of noise at this hour? Frustrated, I decided to knock on the door of the apartment next door, to see and politely ask them to keep it down. But when I stepped out into the hallway, I realized I had never actually seen anyone coming in or out of that apartment. In fact, I couldn't even remember hearing any signs of life from it before that night. The door to see was plain and unremarkable, just like all the others in the building. I knocked lightly, not wanting to disturb the entire floor, but there was no response. I waited a few moments, then knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. Maybe they hadn't heard me, or maybe I was overreacting. The noise had stopped, after all. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. The faint outline of a dusty handprint on the door. It looked old, like it had been there for a while. Shaking off a sense of unease, I returned to my apartment and tried to forget about it. The noise didn't start up again that night, and I figured it was just one of those weird apartment building quirks. Every place has them, right? But over the next few days, the thudding noise returned, always late at night and always coming from to see. It was relentless, and the more I heard it, the more it gnawed at my nerves. I started to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone in my apartment. It was an irrational feeling, I knew, but it clung to me like a shadow. Then one evening, as I was leaving for work, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. I was locking my door when I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. Turning my head, I saw the door to see slowly creak open. It was just a sliver, barely enough to see inside, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, had opened that door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, nothing but the faint hum of the building's old ventilation system. After what felt like an eternity, the door to see closed with a soft click. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it my imagination? No, I was sure of it. The door had opened. But who had opened it? And why? Feeling shaken, I went to work, but the incident stayed with me all night. When I returned in the early hours of the morning, I checked the hallway again. The door to see was closed, just as it had been when I left. I half expected to hear the thudding noise when I got back inside my apartment, but the night was eerily quiet. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I knocked on the door of the apartment across the hall, hoping the couple who lived there might know something about the strange goings on in to see. The woman who answered the door looked surprised to see me. "Hi, I'm your neighbor from to be," I began awkwardly. "I was just wondering if you've noticed anything strange about the apartment next door." The one in to see, her expression changed immediately, and she glanced nervously back at her husband, who had appeared in the doorway behind her. "We don't talk about that apartment," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Her husband stepped forward, his face grim. It's been empty for years. No one's lived there since, well, since the last tenant disappeared. A chill ran down my spine. Disappeared? What happened? The couple exchanged uneasy glances before the husband spoke again. The guy who lived there before you moved in. Young guy, kept to himself mostly. One day, he just vanished. No one's seen or heard from him since. The police investigated, but they couldn't find any trace of him. After that, the apartment was sealed up, and no one's rented it since. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. But I've been hearing noises from that apartment. Someone's in there. The woman shook her head. No one's supposed to be in there. The landlord won't even let anyone near it. He says it's cursed. Cursed. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with the couple's words. Could it really be true? Could the apartment next door be haunted? I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of it sent a shiver down my spine. Around midnight, the thudding noise started again. But this time, it was different, louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from my front door. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was relentless, like someone was trying to break down the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building manager, my hands shaking. "Someone's at my door," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding. "I'll be right there," he said, and I hung up, praying he'd arrive soon. The noise continued for what felt like an eternity. I backed away from the door, terrified that it would burst open at any moment. But just as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. The hallway outside was deathly silent. Then slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I screamed, backing up as far as I could. Just as the door swung open to reveal the building manager standing there, looking confused and concerned. "There's no one here," he said, glancing down the hallway. I rushed forward, my eyes darting around the empty corridor. He was right. The hallway was deserted, but I knew what I had heard. Someone, or something, had been pounding on my door. I explained everything to the building manager, but he seemed skeptical. He assured me that the apartment in C had been empty for years, and there was no way anyone could be living there. But as he spoke, I noticed something behind him. The door to C was open, just a crack, and through the sliver of darkness, I saw a pair of cold, lifeless eyes staring back at me. I moved out the next day. I had always been skeptical of creepy neighbor stories. I mean, how bad could it really get? People living close together often have quirks, right? The man who collects odd things, the woman who feeds stray cats, or the person who plays music just a little too loud at night. None of that ever seemed like the kind of thing that could lead to horror. But after moving into my new apartment, I learned how wrong I was. The apartment building I moved into was a 6-story brick structure, nothing fancy, but it had a charm. The real selling point was that it was affordable, clean, and close to my workplace. What sealed the deal was the view from my window. I had a straight line of sight across the street to the building opposite mine, an older, weathered structure, but one that looked occupied and maintained. After a few months of settling in, my routine became simple: work, home, relax. I enjoyed my evenings on the couch, often watching TV or reading. I didn't have much contact with my neighbors, but I occasionally nodded hello to the older couple on the floor below mine. They were friendly enough, but everyone seemed to keep to themselves, which I appreciated. It wasn't until one late evening that I first noticed him. I was relaxing in my living room, glancing absently out the window, when I saw movement across the street. There was a man standing at the window of the building opposite mine, directly across from my apartment. His face was obscured by the curtain, but I could see his silhouette clearly against the dim glow of the room behind him. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, facing my window. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he was just looking out at the street or taking a break from whatever he was doing. People glance out their windows all the time. But there was something about the way he stood there and moving that gave me a strange feeling. It was late, after all, and the street was quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, just the eerie silence of a residential block at night. I turned my attention back to the TV, trying to ignore the creeping discomfort I felt. But when I looked back at the window a few minutes later, the man was still there, standing in exactly the same spot. His posture was rigid, and his face was still obscured by the curtain. I felt a chill run down my spine. Trying not to overthink it, I closed my blinds, telling myself that it was probably nothing. Maybe he was lost in thought, or maybe I was imagining things, but the unease lingered. For the next few days, I avoided looking out my window at night. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, even when I was alone in my apartment. I started to notice small, odd things, like the way the lights in the building across the street would flicker at random times, or how the man's silhouette would occasionally appear in different windows on different floors. It seemed like no matter where I looked, he was there. I started to obsess over it, catching glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, always watching. But no matter how long I stared, I could never make out his face. It was always obscured by shadow or the curtain, like he didn't want to be seen. One night, I decided I had had enough. I wanted to know who this guy was and why he seemed to be watching me. Maybe it was just some harmless, lonely guy who didn't realize how unsettling he was being. Or maybe there was something more to it. I needed to find out. I waited until the evening, when I knew he would appear again. Sure enough, as soon as the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, I saw him, standing at the window, just as he always did. I grabbed my phone and took a deep breath. I wasn't going to confront him directly, that seemed reckless, but I had an idea. There was an apartment listing for the building across the street that I had seen online when I was apartment hunting. It was an old place, with only a handful of units, so I figured if I called and asked a few questions, I might be able to get some information. I found the number for the building's property manager and dialed. A woman answered after a few rings, and I explained that I was interested in the apartment across the street. "Oh, that building," she said, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "It's mostly empty these days. We've been having trouble filling the units." I pressed on, trying to sound casual. "What about the people who live there now? I think I've seen someone in the window." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Which apartment are you asking about?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure if I wanted to know the answer. "The one on the third floor, directly across from mine." The silence stretched for so long that I thought the call had dropped. But then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no one living in that apartment." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "What do you mean?" "I see someone there almost every night. That unit's been vacant for over a year," she said, her voice growing shaky. "No one's been in there since the last tenant disappeared." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. My hands were shaking as I lowered the phone and looked out the window again. The man was still there, standing at the window, completely motionless. I closed my blinds, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think. Was it possible that someone was squatting in the empty apartment? Or worse, was I seeing something that wasn't supposed to be there? The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares of shadowy figures standing in my apartment, watching me. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, constantly checking the window, expecting to see the man at any moment. Then, one night, everything changed. It was raining, a heavy downpour that rattled the windows and soaked the streets. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard a knock at my door. I froze, my heart racing. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. I hadn't ordered food, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, I stood up and approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it the landlord, a neighbor, or was it him? I opened the door just a crack, enough to peek through. My breath caught in my throat. It was the man from across the street. He stood there, drenched from the rain, his face still obscured by the shadows of his hooded jacket. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew it was him. The same posture, the same unsettling stillness. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I was too terrified to speak, and he made no move to explain himself. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every noise, every creak of the building, made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear another knock at the door, but it never came. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my belongings and moved out within the week. I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just needed to get as far away from that apartment as possible. I never found out who that man was, or why he had been watching me. I didn't want to know. But to this day, whenever I pass by a window, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching, waiting for the right moment to knock on my door again. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it would be a fresh start. The location was perfect, close to work, and the building had a charming vintage appeal. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I had only exchanged polite nods and small talk with a few of them during my first week. One neighbor in particular caught my attention, Mrs. Collins, who lived in the unit directly across from mine. She was an elderly woman, often seen tending to her plants on the balcony. Her floral arrangements were breathtaking, but her eyes held a depth that unsettled me. I tried to ignore the prickling sensation I felt whenever I crossed paths with her, chalking it up to my anxiety about living alone for the first time. However, strange occurrences began to unfold around me. It started with subtle noises, soft thuds and faint whispers drifting through the thin walls at odd hours of the night. I would wake up, heart racing, convinced I was hearing someone in distress. But when I listened closely, the sounds vanished into silence. One night, while watching a new series, I heard a knock on my door. Startled, I paused the show and glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. My heart began to pound as I peered through the peephole. To my surprise, I saw Mrs. Collins standing there, her frail form illuminated by the dim hallway light. "Can I help you?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry to bother you, dear, but I was wondering if you could help me with something," she replied, her voice shaky yet sweet. "Oh, sure," I responded, opening the door slightly. "What do you need? I can't seem to find my cat, Muffin. I thought I heard her meowing around your door earlier," she explained, anxiety etched on her face. I remembered seeing a fluffy tabby cat darting around the building earlier that week but hadn't thought much of it. "I'll help you look for her," I offered, stepping out into the hallway. We searched the floor together, calling out Muffin's name. Each door we passed felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered. After several minutes of searching, I finally spotted the cat nestled behind a potted plant in the corner. "There she is," I exclaimed, reaching down to coax her out. Mrs. Collins beamed with gratitude, her eyes glistening. "Thank you so much. You've made an old lady very happy." As we returned to her apartment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe I was being paranoid about my new living situation. That was until I noticed something odd about her door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dark, shadowy interior. As we entered, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, thick with an inexplicable weight. "Make yourself at home," Mrs. Collins said, her voice soft and inviting. The apartment was filled with an array of plants, their vibrant colors contrasting sharply against the dull walls. But there was something off about the decor. Old photographs lined the shelves, and they seemed to be of her, only younger. The images depicted her with different men, smiling in ways that felt too intimate for a neighborly visit. I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. "Your plants are beautiful," I managed to say, trying to ignore the uncomfortable tension creeping in. "Oh, thank you. They need a lot of care, just like people," she replied, her smile fading for a moment. "But some plants, you see, can be untrustworthy." "Untrustworthy?" I asked, confused. "Just like people," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You never know who to trust, do you?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "I guess not," I said slowly. "I have a special plant that I've kept for many years. It helps me see things that others can't." Her gaze drifted to a particularly large, twisted plant in the corner of her living room, its leaves casting eerie shadows on the wall. "Can I show you?" she asked, almost too eagerly. I hesitated. "Maybe another time. It's getting late, and I should." "Nonsense. It's just a little peek." She stepped closer to the plant, her fingers brushing against the leaves like they were alive. "This one shows me things from the past." Despite my instincts telling me to leave, curiosity got the better of me. "What kind of things?" I asked, unable to resist. "Moments, dear. Moments lost in time." She leaned closer, her eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. "Would you like to see?" Before I could respond, she grabbed my wrist and guided me to the plant. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. "Look closely," she urged, her voice a mere whisper now. As I focused on the plant, the room around me faded, and images began to swirl in the leaves. I saw flashes of people, faces contorted in fear, pleading for help. I gasped, pulling away as a rush of dread washed over me. What is this? I stammered, my heart racing. Mrs. Collins' expression changed, a mix of joy and madness flickering across her features. It's the past, the ones who came before you. They never leave, this plant keeps them here. Panic surged within me as I stumbled backward. I think I should go now, I managed to say, my voice trembling. Don't you want to know what happened to them? She pressed, her grip tightening around my arm. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the depth of my mistake. Let me out, I shouted, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Stay with me, Mrs. Collins whispered, her voice now hauntingly melodic. I've waited so long for someone like you. With every ounce of strength, I pushed against the door, adrenaline fueling my escape. I could hear muffled whispers behind me, voices beckoning, begging for release. The shadows danced, and the air thickened around me, suffocating and heavy. Finally, with one last push, the door creaked open, and I bolted into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I reached my own apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could still hear those whispers, echoing in my mind. The next day, I packed my things, determined to leave that haunted place behind. I could still feel Mrs. Collins' gaze on me, an unsettling reminder of the darkness that lurked just next door. As I stepped outside, I noticed the old house once more, its windows clouded and lifeless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of the past lingered on the edge of my vision, waiting for the next unsuspecting tenant to cross their threshold. As I drove away, I stole one last glance at the apartment building in my rearview mirror. A figure stood on the balcony, her silhouette stark against the morning light. Mrs. Collins waved, her smile wide and knowing. In that moment, I understood. The darkness had not just clung to her but had woven itself into the very fabric of the building. I was free now, but the ghosts of that house would remain, always seeking someone to share their secrets with. The rain poured relentlessly against the window, creating a symphony of patters that echoed through the dimly lit apartment. I had recently moved into this third-floor unit in a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, hoping for a fresh start after a messy breakup. As I unpacked boxes, a growing sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The layout of the apartment was oddly arranged, with long, narrow hallways and rooms that felt too small. But I brushed it off, attributing my discomfort to being in a new place. I met my neighbors soon after moving in. Most were polite, exchanging casual greetings and smiles. However, it was the tenant in 3B that piqued my curiosity. I had never seen him, though I often heard strange noises coming from his apartment. Muffled thuds, dragging sounds, and an eerie humming that seeped through the thin walls late at night. One evening, as I returned home from work, I caught a glimpse of the neighbor in question. He was a tall, lanky man with disheveled hair, his face shadowed under a hood. He stood by the door of 3B, fiddling with something in his hands. When he noticed me, he quickly glanced away, a flicker of something, fear, paranoia, crossing his features before he slipped inside. After that encounter, I became increasingly aware of his presence. The noises from his apartment grew louder, more frequent, and increasingly disturbing. Other times, it sounded like he was having arguments with someone. though I could never make out any words. Curiosity morphed into dread, and I found myself avoiding the hallway as much as possible. One night, after tossing and turning in bed, I heard a loud crash coming from 3D. The sound jolted me upright, my heart racing. I waited, breath held, for something more, a scream, perhaps, or another sound that would confirm my fears, but nothing came. Instead, the silence stretched into the early hours of the morning, and I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I mustered the courage to knock on his door. My knuckles rapped against the wood with a soft thud. A moment later, I heard shuffling from within. The door creaked open, revealing the man from last night, his eyes wide and frantic. Hi, I'm your neighbor from 3A, I said, forcing a smile. I just wanted to check on you. I heard a noise last night. Are you okay? He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to gauge my intentions. Yeah, I'm fine, he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Just working on some stuff. Okay, well, if you need anything, let me know. I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. I'm usually home in the evenings. He nodded but didn't respond further, retreating back into his apartment and shutting the door softly. I turned and walked away, unease creeping back into my mind. The days passed, and the noises continued. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was none of my business. Yet, something deep inside urged me to investigate further. I spent my evenings listening intently, piecing together the sounds like a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes I heard crying, followed by laughter, then silence. Other times, it sounded as if someone was dragging heavy furniture or whispering frantically. One night, curiosity overtook my fear. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed into the hallway, the faint light flickering from the ceiling. Standing in front of 3D, I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything that might explain the bizarre behavior of my neighbor. Suddenly, I heard his voice, clear and urgent. No, don't, you can't, he shouted, his tone rising with panic. I jumped back, heart pounding in my chest. Should I call the police? I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Just as I turned to leave, the door swung open, and the man stood there, his face flushed and wild-eyed. Why were you listening? He demanded, his voice low but furious. I wasn't trying to intrude. I just heard you shouting, I stammered, taken aback by his aggression. He seemed to deflate a bit, the tension in his shoulders easing. I'm sorry, I'm just dealing with some things. It's been hard. Just stay away from me. With that, he shut the door, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hallway, feeling unsettled. I went back to my apartment, my mind racing with questions. What was happening behind that door? Why did he seem so terrified? Days turned into weeks, and my obsession with the mysterious neighbor deepened. I became a silent observer, noting the times he left and returned, the way he hurried past me with his head down, avoiding eye contact. I even started to jot down my thoughts in a notebook, documenting his behaviors like a detective in a crime novel. One evening, the air was thick with an electric tension as a storm rolled in. I could see flashes of lightning illuminating the sky through my window, and I couldn't help but feel that something was about to change. The thunder rumbled ominously, echoing like the pounding of my heart. As I sat on my couch, unable to focus on the TV, I noticed the lights flickering. They dimmed and then brightened again, plunging my apartment into an eerie gloom. I glanced toward 3D, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the window. Compelled by an unknown force, I grabbed my notebook and crept into the hallway. The air felt charged, as if something momentous was about to unfold. I stood outside his door, hesitating for just a moment, then knocked softly. "Hello," I called out, hoping for an answer. Silence answered back. Then I heard a low whimper, followed by muffled cries. Panic surged through me. "Are you okay?" I shouted, banging on the door. "Please, let me help you." The cries stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that sent chills down my spine. Just as I was about to turn away, the door swung open with a creak. The man stood there, disheveled and wide-eyed, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I heard you crying. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" I pressed, my heart racing at the vulnerability in his expression. He hesitated, glancing behind him as if something lurked in the shadows of his apartment. "I'm fine. I just need to be alone." I stepped closer, my instinct overriding my fear. "Please, if something's wrong, get out," he shouted suddenly, slamming the door in my face. Stunned, I stumbled backward, feeling a rush of anger and fear. I was about to walk away when I heard something that stopped me cold, a sharp scream, echoing through the hallway. It was faint but unmistakable, piercing through the air like a knife. "Help!" I heard a woman's voice cry out from inside. My heart raced as adrenaline kicked in. Without thinking, I slammed my shoulder against the door, forcing it open. It swung wide, revealing a scene that sent my mind spiraling. The apartment was dimly lit, cluttered with broken furniture and overturned plants. In the corner, a woman was crouched on the floor, her hands over her head, trembling in fear. The man stood at the opposite end, his back to me, facing a wall. He muttered to himself, words I couldn't quite hear. "Get away from her," I yelled, stepping into the room. He turned around slowly, his face twisted in anguish. "You don't understand," he screamed. "I have to keep her safe." "Who is she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't let them take her," he shouted, and in that moment, I understood. He was not just protecting the woman. He was trapped in his own mind, lost in a maze of paranoia and fear. "Please, we need to get her out of here," I said softly, trying to reach him. "You're not alone. I can help you." His eyes flickered with recognition, and for a brief moment, the wildness faded. "You don't know what's happening," he murmured, the fight leaving his body. "They're watching. They're always watching." Before I could respond, the lights flickered violently, and I felt a chill wash over me. Shadows seemed to stretch across the room, twisting and contorting like living creatures. The woman gasped, inching closer to me as if I were her only lifeline. "We need to leave," I urged, grabbing her hand. The man hesitated, a tortured expression on his face. "You can't leave. If you do, they'll come for you too." "Who?" I pressed, desperate for answers. But just then, the shadows surged, enveloping him. I could hear his panicked breaths, the crackling energy in the air overwhelming us. "Run!" I shouted to the woman, pulling her toward the door. We raced out into the hallway, the darkness swirling behind us. The oppressive energy clung to my skin, a weight pressing down as we dashed toward the stairwell. The woman stumbled, and I turned to help her, glancing back at the apartment. The door slammed shut behind us, trapping the man inside. "We have to get out of here," I yelled, leading her down the stairs. We burst into the lobby, the bright lights feeling like a beacon of safety. But as we stepped into the open, I realized something was terribly wrong. The air outside was heavy, thick with a suffocating darkness. I looked around, panic flooding my senses. "Where are we?" I gasped. "I don't know," the woman replied, her voice trembling. "But we have to keep moving." We darted into the street, rain pouring down and drowning out our cries for help. The world felt distorted, like we were caught in a nightmare. "Why were you in there?" I asked, trying to make sense of it all. "I was trapped," she said, her voice breaking. "He thought he was protecting me, but it was him who needed saving." A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I glanced back at the building, a silhouette against the stormy night. The windows were dark, lifeless, as if they held secrets too horrific to share. "What do we do now?" I asked, desperate to understand how to escape the grip of this dark reality. "We can't go back," she said firmly, tears streaming down her face. "If we do, they'll get us. We have to find help." But as we stumbled into the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was not just a product of the storm. It had seeped into the very fabric of our lives, a shadow lurking just out of sight, ready to claim its next victim. The rain fell harder, soaking us to the bone as we ran. I felt the weight of fear pressing against my chest, the knowledge that something sinister had taken root in our lives. Somewhere behind us, the man's voice echoed in the storm, filled with desperation and madness. "You can't escape. You're already one of us." I turned to the woman, terror swirling in my gut. "We need to keep moving. We can't let him find us again." But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness was already inside us, an echo of fear and despair that would follow us wherever we went. As we fled into the night, the rain washed away the blood, but it could never cleanse the memory of what we had witnessed. And in that moment, I understood. The Watcher was never truly gone. He would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next chance to pull us back into his web of fear and madness.